Good morning. We thank you for being a part of worship. Thank you for already joining us for worship with our music, and we thank our music and our praise team for all that they do to provide worship. Our songs have been wonderful this morning, and our worship has all been wonderful, but we long for the day when we can have you back in worship with us, and that day will come soon. We are in Mark chapter 10, verse 46 through 52. The sermon is entitled, Do You See? Mark chapter 10, verse 46 through 52. So this is a healing story and a miracle story, but it's also a call story because the emphasis is on a man and his faith. There is challenge, there's distraction, there's interruption in our story today. There are 3 acts in the book of Mark. In Mark chapter 1, beginning in chapter 1 and moving through 8:21, the first act is in a geographical location that is Galilee, in and around Galilee. The second act talks about a geographical location is chapter 8, verse 22, and it goes through the end of our story today, chapter 10, verse 52, and that is where Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem. The last act in Mark is the third act in Mark is chapter 11, verse 1, and goes to the end of Mark, and it's in the capital itself. Our story that we find today in Mark chapter 10, verse 46 through 52, takes place in the last week of Jesus' earthly ministry. In that second act where Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem, there are 2 healing of the blind stories that bookend that act. The first one being in chapter 8, verse 22 and starting, is a blind man, but he's passive. He's brought to Jesus. And then the other one that bookends that is at the end of that Act 2, and it is where our story picks up about Bartimaeus, and he takes the initiative in calling out to Jesus. So Mark chapter 10, starting in verse 46, let's read that together. Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped and said, call him. So they called to the blind man, cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked. The blind man said, Rabboni, I want to see. Go, said Jesus, your faith has healed you. Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. When our story picks up, it picks up where they're coming into Jericho. What about Jericho? Well, we know that Jericho is 17 miles northeast of Jerusalem, that it's one of the lowest lying cities at 825 feet below sea level. It's also a city that has some of the oldest settlements dating back to 9,000 BC. But it was a winding 17-mile road that was made famous in Luke's parable of the Good Samaritan. That 3,500-foot ascent from Jericho to Jerusalem is what Luke's parable is about, because that winding road, it talks about thieves and robbers hiding in that area. But today we hear about beggars, and specifically Bartimaeus, on that road from Jericho to Jerusalem. So who was Bartimaeus? Well, Bartimaeus and Lazarus are the only 2 people that Jesus healed that are named in the Bible. Lazarus, being the brother of Mary and Martha, was raised from the dead. And that story is in John. But Bartimaeus, his story is in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and he is the only one in those gospels that is mentioned by name that he was healed. We find out in our story today in the Bible that his name means son of Timaeus. Bar is an Aramaic word which means son, and Timaeus is a Greek word which means honorable. So Bartimaeus is just the son of a father named Timaeus, or son of Timaeus. So many had rebuked him, and we find out his name, and Mark mentioning his name among the disciples may mean that he was well known. Maybe they thought, oh yeah, you remember Bartimaeus as they were writing their gospel? He's the one that followed us. So the other information we have about Bartimaeus is that he is blind. How many of you have cataracts or eyeglasses or contacts? You know, I've had contacts for over 40 years. They were the greatest invention, because before that I had eyeglasses, and my eyeglasses were the thickness of pop bottles, or if you live below the Red River, that would be Coke bottles. But they were very thick. In fact, the girls didn't pay much attention until after I got contacts. That's why it was one of the greatest inventions ever. And that happened while I was in high school. In 2016, they had done a study that above the age of 16, there were 7.65 million people in the United States that were visually impaired. That's 2.4% of our population that are visually impaired. I remember going on mission trips, and we went on several mission trips while I was at Jersey Village. And we went to Costa Rica, and we went to Chihuahua, and we did clinics with Dr. Ugo in and around Chihuahua and some of those other areas. And we took a couple who were dear friends of mine in Jersey Village, and their names were Walter and Barbara McKinney. Walter and Barbara would collect eyeglasses all year long, and they would figure out the power on those glasses, and they would put those in baggies, and they would take them with them. And then when they would get to one of the places where we would be holding a clinic, they would have an eye chart, and the people in the village and the towns would come out, and they would come to the clinic, and then when they get to Walter and Barbara's eye station, they would read that chart, and Walter and Barbara would fix them up with eyeglasses, and I would walk over because there was something about seeing somebody putting on glasses and being able to see. They were smiling again. They were excited about the opportunity they had. So how many people in biblical times would have been around that would have been blind? What would have been considered blind in biblical times? Obviously, if they had cataracts back then, they couldn't have the surgery that we're able to have now, but even nearsightedness and farsightedness would have been considered blind in biblical times. To be blind meant that you suffered significantly, that you had a disability, that there was loss of productivity and a diminished quality of life. In fact, a loss of social status. So for Bartimaeus, he experienced that. He was an outcast, excluded from temple worship. So here's blind Bartimaeus, and then we hear about the crowd. And it was this unusual, tumultuous crowd that had alerted him, that made him start grabbing people's garments as they went by, trying to find out who or what was all the commotion about. He was demanding answers. But when he tried to find out, there were no telling how many times that he was pushed away by the crowd, and they were trying to free themselves so that they could hurry on. Eventually, he made somebody tell them what was going on. He found out that it was Jesus of Nazareth. Bartimaeus lived prepared. He had a plan, and we have to have a plan to catch and latch onto our miracle as it does a flyby one day. Blind Bartimaeus knew about Jesus already. He knew because we know the title that he uses. He had a plan for the day that Jesus would turn up, and people tried to exclude him again and again, as they had always done in his life. So it wasn't happenstance that the crowd around Christ had to go by him on the way out of town. He had found the high road out of town and positioned himself. Metaphorically speaking, he found a niche in the market long ago, filled it, and was biding his time. So we too, don't just sit there excluded and bitter, but be armed with a plan for that opportunity when your dream or miracle comes along. Bartimaeus began to shout, we hear in verses 47 and 48. That word shout is the Greek word to scream or to cry out so that somebody could hear you. The kingdom of heaven is not for the well-meaning, but for the desperate. For Bartimaeus, his desperation was a doorway to his faith. You may not have everything, but you have something. The loss of one thing is not the loss of everything. Don't let your blindness, don't be so blindly focused on your blindness that you lose sight of what's going on around you. Bartimaeus didn't have his sight, but he had his hearing. He had his voice. He had his other senses. And he had his reasoning, and he had his hunger for a change of circumstances, and he had his persistence. In fact, if you looked at it, Bartimaeus was absolutely resource rich. In Bartimaeus, as he shouts out that title for Jesus, is only the second person to use that title in Mark's gospel, the first being Peter. It was a Christological title. His title, Son of David, affirms Jesus' royal authority. It's expressed in therapeutic works of mercy and deliverance. It's a messianic title, but it has all the thoughts of a conquering Messiah, a king of David's line who would lead Israel to national greatness. It harkens back to the first chapter of Matthew in the New Testament, where in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, we read, it says that Jesus is the son of David, the son of Abraham. The title, the Son of David, is more than just a genealogical connection. It's a shocking theological confession that makes a miracle of healing pale in comparison. You see, the blind beggar ironically sees Jesus better than those with two eyes. What Bartimaeus lacks in eyesight, he makes up for in insight. So who was he with? The crowd, they were accustomed to him. They were accustomed to his plight. There's a word is inured. It means accustomed to something unpleasant. They were accustomed to people begging on the side of the road. That detail reminds us that blind beggars dwell on the bottom rung of social privilege, not just in biblical times, but even in today's society. Do people shout Bartimaeus down because they think that he deserves to be blind? Probably. Do they put their needs before his? Perhaps. Many that were rebuking him in the crowd were trying to silence Bartimaeus, either because he was disturbing Jesus as he was teaching, or they feared that the authorities would hear Bartimaeus and come and arrest Jesus. Who was this crowd? It could have been the followers and pilgrims accompanying Jesus to Jerusalem, and it could have included the disciples. We even hear earlier in Mark chapter 10 that the disciples had rebuked those bringing the children to Jesus in Mark 10 verses 13 through 16. So already the disciples had rebuked somebody in this chapter. But the persistence of Bartimaeus, despite the hindrances, was remarkable. For you see, nothing could keep him from coming face to face with the one person with whom he could connect with and confront with his trouble. So what does he use? His voice. He makes a scene. The more people try to quieten him, the louder he gets. You see, Mark's gospel talks about faith, and it talks about the obstacles that we encounter with faith. It's filled with those. In Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, we hear about the friends of the paralytic man who have to cut a hole in the roof to get to Jesus with their friend. In Mark chapter 5, verse 28, we hear about the woman with a blood disease. And she had to overcome her fear to reach out and find the master's touch and feel Jesus' healing. Later in Mark chapter 5, verse 35 and 36, Jairus has to overcome, and he has to help him continue to believe in the news, continue to believe in Jesus, even though the news of his daughter's death. In Mark chapter 7, verses 27 and 28, there's the Syrophoenician woman, and she must overcome and she must persist in her request, even though Jesus' initial response is that his ministry is to the Jews. And then in Mark chapter 9, verse 24, there's the father of the demonized boy. And he has to summon even greater faith in the ability to believe in Jesus. The more they hushed him, the more they shushed him, the more he rushed at his solution. How remarkable it is that the Son of Man allows a poor and powerless person to stop him in his tracks. John Canary, who wrote A Cup of Chicken Cup Soup for the Soul, tells the story of Charlie Boswell. Charlie Boswell was a great athlete. He played for the University of Alabama. He was a halfback back in the 1940s. His goal was to be a professional baseball player, and he was playing minor league baseball when he was drafted to go into World War II. While in World War II, Charlie was trying to help a friend and rescue a friend who was in a tank that was under fire by the Germans. In that rescue, Charlie had an accident that while he was there helping his friend, and it caused blindness. There were many unsuccessful surgeries, and eventually Charlie was brought over to the States, but nothing could help him, and he remained blind. His therapist that worked with him was a man named Kenny. Kenny introduced him to the sport of golf, something that Charlie never tried while he had eyesight. And Charlie picked up on golf. Charlie became the United States Blind Golfers Association champion 13 times. He won 17 tournaments in the United States and 11 tournaments internationally. Charlie won many awards, but the most prestigious award that Charlie Boswell won was the Ben Hogan Award in 1958. So there was the opportunity that Charlie had to meet Ben Hogan when he got the award. And he was truly excited about meeting his idol. He got to introduce himself to Ben Hogan and said, "Ben, there is one thing I've always wanted to do, and that's play a round of golf with you." And Ben Hogan said, "It would be an honor to play a round of golf with you, Charlie," because Ben knew his accomplishments and knew his skills, also knowing what had happened in World War II. That's when Charlie Boswell said, "And Ben, we need to play for money." And Ben Hogan said, "Oh, I could not do that. That would not be fair." And Charlie Boswell said, "No, we need to play for money, $1,000 a hole." And Ben Hogan said, "Hey, now what would people think of me taking advantage of you and your circumstances?" And Mr. Boswell said, "What are you, chicken, Mr. Hogan?" A frustrated Hogan said, "All right, you're on, but I want you to know I'm going to play my best." Boswell said, "I wouldn't expect anything less." And Hogan said, "You name the time and place," and Boswell said, "Tonight at midnight." You see, Boswell leveled the playing field. Before that, he wouldn't have been able to beat him in the daytime, but he leveled the playing field. Jesus levels the playing field. To call a blind man and say to come to him, a blind man is now on the front of the scene. He is now the one that Jesus is mentioning. So call is mentioned 3 times in verse 49. Bartimaeus is not the only one to use the loud voice, because now the text says that Jesus calls him. And then they called the blind man, is what our text says. Presumably, Jesus could have walked over to Bartimaeus. He could have talked with him. Everything could have been fine, and he could have healed him. But instead, in an ironic twist, he tells the onlookers to summon Bartimaeus to them, or to him. Now, those who sought to inhibit the beggar must assist Jesus' ministry to him. So what do they say? Cheer up. Take courage. Be courageous. On your feet, he's calling you. You know, we hear that word take courage or take heart 7 times in the New Testament. All of the other times, Jesus says it, but this is the only time that the crowd says it, and they say that, cheer up, take heart. And then one of the most remarkable parts of the story is what Mark says next. Throwing aside his garment. You see, Mark adds this delicious detail that Bartimaeus tosses aside his cloak, because obviously one would expect to regain their sight when they do that. For a blind beggar like Bartimaeus, he would ordinarily keep his possessions close at hand. But he expects a change in his status. His health problems, his blindness, and his economic problems, his begging, are tied up in a single piece of fabric. But Jesus can restore Bartimaeus to a place of wholeness that will demand his belonging with society. When Bartimaeus casts off his cloak, he confidently prefigures that he will no longer sit on his garment, depending on the handouts of those who pass by. That mantle in which he had slept, in which he had spread before him beside the road to collect the alms, seems to be his sole possession and the means of his livelihood. I mentioned that this story was a call story and not just a healing and a miracle. It's because his casting away the cloak corresponds to the other disciples that had to leave their boats, leave their tax desks and everything else, and provide a dramatic contrast to that one that was mentioned in chapter 10 right before this, the rich young ruler who was also called to follow and made the great refusal. Already in Paul's time, becoming a Christian meant receiving a new identity, symbolized by putting on new garments. Galatians 3, verse 27 says, "For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ." I heard a great quote. It says, "Casual discipleship is shaped by culture. A discipleship based on Christ is shaped by Jesus. Cultural discipleship desires that Christ be a patch that fits into a garment that culture makes, rather than Christ being the whole garment that we wear." By throwing aside his cloak, Bartimaeus threw off the garment of his old self and the life he had been living in blindness. Beside the way rather than on it, he was ready to put on Christ, to follow in discipleship. That garment that Bartimaeus would sit in day by day was not a comfort zone. It was a controlling zone. You see, Satan wants to control us. He wants to think that we can't get out of a place that we're stuck in, a place of sin, a place of loneliness, a place of fear, a place of depression, a place of unforgiveness. We must be willing to break free from those things that shackle us. We, like Bartimaeus, need to make a radical break from our past, to throw off that cloak that we have been stuck on. Theologian R. Allen Culpepper says, "Discipleship mandates that one's former way of life can neither be patched up or retrieved at will." Bartimaeus, when he finally gets Jesus' attention and is summoned, the text says that he eagerly leaps to his feet. He jumps to his feet, and the title change. The title changes from Jesus to Rabboni, my master. It is as a disciple that Bartimaeus calls Jesus this, and his faith is confirmed. And then we hear Jesus' question, "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus stands before you and I today and asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" And until we can say specifically what we have going on in our life, we'll never get anything answered. You can't pray specifically until you're willing to admit your point of need. God can't help you until you say, "Lord, I have a problem with addiction and I need help overcoming it. Lord, I have a problem with anger or gossip or bitterness, and I need help overcoming it. I have a problem with a relationship, God, and I need your forgiveness." What do you want me to do for you is the most important question that God asks of us, and the one to which we frequently give the wrong answer. We ask for all the wrong things in life. Our answer to the question, it'll reveal whether we want death or life, whether we want to be healed or we selfishly want God to do our bidding and fulfill our desires. You see, that question, "What do you want me to do for you?" This is the second time it appears in Mark chapter 10. If you go just a few verses before our story, in Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 37, you see the story of the disciples. And it says in verse 35, "Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we want you to do for us whatever we ask.' 'What do you want me to do for you?' he asked. They replied, 'Let one of us sit at your right and one of us at your left in your glory.'" Jesus asked him the same question he asked Bartimaeus. And what do the sons of thunder want? They want extraordinary glory. What does Bartimaeus want? Ordinary health. James and John seek power and glory. The blind man only wants to see. True discipleship means seeing the world God's way and submitting our life to his purpose and will. So this reiterates that Jesus has not come to bestow power and honor, but to open eyes to the new spiritual, social, and material realities made possible when God reigns. When it comes to understanding what Jesus has come to do, the disciples, James and John, they're more blind than Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus asks for the right things. When Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" his reply is a simple request, voiced with the confidence that Jesus can deliver. That I would see again, declares resolutely that Jesus can bring the wholeness and deliverance that people seek. He asks not to be superhuman, but simply human. For the well, normalcy is the bare minimum. But for the ill and the troubled, normalcy is God's greatest gift. So he knew precisely what he wanted, his sight. You don't go to the dentist with a sore tooth that possibly has to be pulled, and you tell that dentist, when the dentist says, "Which one is it that's hurting?" you say, "Oh, I'll just find anyone in there." You're very specific. You say, that one right there. Don't touch any other tooth because you're specific. That's the way we have to be. It takes self-examination to be honest with Jesus. And then Jesus' healing was immediate. Master, Rabboni, he is the one that can give sight. Luke chapter 4, verse 18 through 21, it says this, Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. Then he began by saying, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Only Jesus is the one who came to help people receive their sight. If you look back in Mark chapter 10, there's two potential recruits in this chapter. I mentioned one of them to you. It's the rich young ruler. The first, being him, was admirable, respectable, and wealthy. But to the disciples' disbelief, he had not been welcomed into the Jesus group. Now we meet a man at quite the opposite end of the scale of social acceptability, a blind beggar. For the rich man, he lists his good deeds he hopes will earn him eternal life. Bartimaeus, all he does is cries out for mercy. He comes empty and so receives the gift of physical healing and spiritual sight. The rich man, however, comes with his life full of riches and so has no room left for God's grace, the only thing that will provide entrance into the kingdom of God. And it is Bartimaeus, rather than the rich man, who will end up following Jesus with his sight restored, whereas the rich man has gone away blind. Bartimaeus has nothing to lose, nothing to sell, and so his commitment can be immediate and complete. It's easier for Jesus to heal physical blindness than to heal the spiritual blindness of his followers. Bartimaeus' perception as an outsider stands in vivid contrast to the blindness of the disciples as insiders. One of the thoughts about this chapter 2 is we have a responsibility to see every person is of value and is made in the image of God, and so we are to love them as much. Jesus saw the value in people throughout his ministry. He tried to get the crowd to understand value who had pushed him to the side. Jesus wanted them to call him because they need to understand compassion and grace like Jesus has. The ability to assign value is one of the rarest gifts in the world. We can assign value. There's the story of the man who went into a small antique shop in San Francisco. It was cluttered, mostly full of knickknacks and junk. But then the man looks down and he sees a bowl. And he thinks for a minute, and he thinks that's from the Chinese dynasty, the Ming dynasty. And he looks at it in closer inspection and realizes it is from the Ming dynasty. It is priceless. Its value could not even be calculated. It was worth more than everything else in the store put together. And obviously the owner doesn't even know what the value of it is, because it's sitting on the floor with milk in it and the cat's drinking out of it. So he sees the opportunity for a plan of the lifetime. He devises a way that he's going to get that bowl for a fraction of the cost. So he goes up to the owner and says, "That is an extraordinary cat you have. How much do you want for it?" And the owner says, "Oh, I can't get rid of that cat. It keeps the shop free from mice." The man says, "I've got to have that cat. I'll pay you $400 for that cat." And the owner just laughs and says, "That cat's not worth $400. He said, "I don't care. I'll pay you $400. And the owner said, "If you want her that much, you can have her." And the man says, "And you know what? I'm going to need something to feed her with. Throw in that bowl for $10. And the owner says, "Oh, I can't do that." He said, "That bowl is priceless. It's from the Ming dynasty. Its value could not be calculated. It's worth more than everything in my store." He said, "But it's a crazy thing. Since I put it down there and put milk in it, I've sold 17 cats. So we can assign value. We know value of things. But the most important thing to know value of is people. Because you see, Jesus knew the value of everyone that he was around, including a beggar that was blind. And we should see value in people. No matter their economic status, no matter their social status, no matter the color of their skin, they are a creation of God, knit together in their mother's womb. They are of value. Pandemics, disease, disasters, disabilities, none of those things can be avoided, and we're figuring that out. But as a church, we must respond like Jesus and not like the crowd. We should share Christ's love for the lost, showing the same love and concern for those on the margins of society, the poor, the disabled, those weighed down by the burdens of life. Then in the final verse of our scripture this morning, Jesus names faith as what impels Bartimaeus. And the rest of the story shows us what that faith is. For Bartimaeus, it wasn't reciting the correct confession. It was the unrelenting conviction that Jesus Christ can and will rescue him from his need. And we see this faith in what Bartimaeus does. Jesus often tells those that are healed, go. Go and show yourselves to a priest. Go and gain priestly confirmation of your healing. Go and return to your home, your family. Go and bear testimony. It was a dismissal, but go does not always mean go away, so that Bartimaeus disobeys Jesus. For Bartimaeus, go meant stop being on the side of the road and get on the road. Whoever asks of Jesus must be willing to follow Jesus, even on the uphill road to the cross. So Bartimaeus, his response was immediate and it was eager. So many of us say, wait. Jesus, I'll go, but wait until I finish this part of my life. Wait until I've done these things, and then I promise you, I will get off the side of the road and I will get on the road and follow you. For Mark, Bartimaeus was the model disciple. He began with a need, he went on to gratitude, and he finished with loyalty. And those are the summary stages of a disciple. Bartimaeus went from being on the side of the road to being on the road. The choice, go. Our way should be Christ's way. We should go Christ's way. Bartimaeus was the only one in the miracle group to join the disciple group. So why is it that so many times we come to church, or in these days, we watch church online, and we leave empty-handed? We turn off the TV and we go about our day. You know, you don't need the outrageous faith of Bartimaeus. You don't need to shout, but you do need to understand that you do not have to come to worship or watch worship and leave empty-handed. Jesus is asking us today, what do you want me to do for you? And what is our reply? Mark's gospel, it impels us to look at the different characters and relate them to our lives, both congregationally and in our life in the community. Who are we like in the different roles? Are we like Bartimaeus? We have a need, or we have prophetic insight? Are we like Jesus that shows compassion and grace? Or are we like the crowd that pushes Bartimaeus away and wants to keep him blind and invisible? Or are we like the crowd that is able to guide him through words of hope to say, cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you?